Well, my brothers and sisters, today's gospel reading is a reflection on the second commandment. Do not take the Lord's name in vain. And in the context that Jesus is speaking, the Jews did not utter the name of God. They had a series of vows because God's name was so sacred. And because in the context of the culture, to name someone or to call someone or something by its name is to possess it. It's to have control over it. And being reverent, faithful people, the Jews would not presume to have control over God or to possess God for their own purposes. And so the series of vows were an approximation. You couldn't pronounce the vows except to breathe. It was the sound of one's breath. And in many ways, this is so appropriate in terms of understanding that part of God which is ungraspable, but is the very essence of life itself. It's appropriate that the combination of these vows should be a breath. And yet, Jesus taught his disciples in the Lord's Prayer to treat God's name as holy. Hallowed be thy name. And this again signifies the holiness of the name of God and not to use God's name in frivolous ways. And in fact, in keeping with this faithful understanding, this reverence for God, we see in the Gospel of John that the Jews want to execute God when he says, I am, signifying that he was taking the name of God, that he was identifying himself with God, and as a matter of fact, in stating that if you see me, you have seen the Father. They considered this blasphemy, and they considered it a violation of the second commandment of taking on the name of God and referring to God directly, possessing God, and using God's name in a frivolous way. And since the Jews felt that it was important to reverence the name of God, there became a sort of corruption in the relationship within the society, within the community. So the people would begin to take a vow, and they wouldn't swear by God's name, because also if you swore by God, that would make him a party to the agreement. It would reduce God to being part of our day-to-day contracts, our agreements between each other, a kind of legalistic approach, which again is unbecoming of the all-knowing, all-powerful, infinite Creator. And so rather than swearing by God, they would swear by a tree or a stone, by the land, by their own head, by something which was created by God, but not God himself. And this was to avoid the blasphemy on the one hand, but many people felt, if I'm not invoking the name of God, then I can't be held to this agreement. I can break it. I haven't sworn by God. I've sworn by some created thing, and therefore I'm not bound. And so Jesus was also responding in this passage to the lack of fidelity, the lack of virtue, the lack of trustworthiness, the lack of meaning to the oaths that people were making, that they were making those oaths only to break them later on. The nature of sin is this compartmentalization. When we separate ourselves or we separate creation from the Creator himself, and when we therefore don't see each other through the eyes of the Creator, and we don't see all of the good that's around us as being goodness that comes from God. This is a kind of compartmentalization, a separation that then makes us susceptible to sin, because then we're more willing to abuse each other and all of the items and possessions and things around us. When I was teaching before entering seminary, both in middle school and in the university, my middle schoolers, particularly the 6th and 7th, 8th graders, had a practice where they would say, "Buy my life," if they really wanted somebody to believe what they were saying. "Buy my life." And they would say this passionately. They would say it sincerely, but many of us as teachers were disturbed because we felt that if you're going to, is this not a cheapening of something that you have no control over? If you pledge, "Buy my life," but your life is not your own. Your life comes from God. It remains in God's hands. And this is not a kind of power that you have. And so Jesus' instruction is to return the people back to a reverence for God, and a reverence for God's creation, and a reverence for God's name. And in order to do that, he says, let your yes be yes, and your no be no. Anything beyond that comes from the evil one. It comes from the evil one because it signifies that if your character is such that we can't trust your word when you give your word, then it signifies a deterioration of your character, an evil that makes you not trustworthy. And if we live in a society where we require these oaths from each other because we can't be trusted, because there's this pervasive suspicion and lack of trustworthiness, then that signifies the presence of original sin, the presence of the evil one throughout our society. Jesus calls us to mend all relationships, to heal, and to be reconciled with God once again. And a sign of that reconciliation, of that healing, is when we're able to approach all of life and all of creation sacramentally and see the presence and goodness of God in all of these things. And when we cultivate in ourselves the virtue, so that instinctively we do those things that are the will of God.